Greetings everyone and welcome to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode we're continuing forward with our VCA series. Joining me back in the studio again today to help us out with that very endeavor is our good friend Mr. Ronnie Wong. Ronnie, welcome back to the show. How's it going today?
It's going great today. It's another beautiful day to be right here in the studio as we continue to take a look at the VCA 6. Remember, that's VMware Certified Associate version 6. And what we're actually taking a look at today, of course, is, well, some of the benefits that we have when we talk about doing data center virtualization. A lot of times when somebody actually asks if they haven't been dealing in the area of virtualization, they may understand the concept of virtualizing and saying, hey, here's something that my company's doing, and we might go, well, we don't see where that fits in for us. And it's not that they can't see it working, but what they don't understand is that there's actually benefits to doing it, and that's what we need to understand is what are the benefits? Why in the world would we choose something like actually data center virtualization when I don't really actually see any real need for it? And the reason why is that there's actually overwhelming benefit to doing it. Now, we've already mentioned in a couple of other shows, especially as we've been reviewing some of the virtualization concepts, but we want to actually take a look a little bit more at the business side of this and talk about some of those different types of benefits that we can actually start to take a look at. So let's go ahead and take a look at my screen here as we kind of get reminded of what we're really dealing with here, right? The very fact is when we talk about a physical data center, okay, remember that there's a ton of different physical components that we have to be able to manage if we're going to be running a data center. And this includes not only servers, but of course switches, routers, firewalls, and of course multiple servers, cabling, you name it. And then that doesn't even include in things that we haven't really mentioned as far as the data center itself, which is normally of course the housing of the building, how much floor space that we need, how much air conditioning do we need to actually run, how much electricity do we need to bring into the building to support everything that we want to actually be able to run. There's a lot that goes into the cost of the data center itself.
You know, it's funny, Ronnie, back in the day, a single computer took up a whole room, and now we have a whole room filled up a bunch of computers. So it's like, it's not that the data center has really shrunk, it's just that we are now able to put more of them in the same room.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? Because of the way that data continues to grow and grow and grow. And you hate to say it, it's like a house in this point. You might have started off where you go, well, you know, we only really have 3 rooms that we have to fill with furniture, and we have an extra bedroom, right? All of a sudden, that extra bedroom, you go and open the door one day, and it's like jam-packed full of stuff, and you're like, what in the world happened? It all actually just takes space, and it begins to fill up. And we started seeing that particular idea again in the physical data center. And we talked about it in terms of what we called the idea of infrastructure sprawl, right? We have space, we have a need. Well, do we want to try and reconfigure everything that we have so that we're much more efficient? Or is it easier just to buy a new one, put it in place, you're just adding an addition to it and go, oh no, we have room that we can actually make right here, and we'll just plug that in and we're off and ready to go. So it continues to stack up and add up the way that we want to.
It's like cell division.
It really does seem to actually work that way in terms of the way that we do infrastructure. So, and you might be wondering, like, well, why do we do stuff like that? Well, a lot of that is because we actually designed that data center, right, to actually be available as often as we can. In other words, we talk about the idea of high availability. 24 hours a day, we want our data to be ready and available. We want to make sure that there's duplication, or redundancy. Excuse me, I keep saying duplication. Redundancy here, right? Just in case one machine fails, we have another one ready to go. We actually start building all that stuff into it. And we actually end up finding out that, hey, that's what ends up happening is this idea of sprawl. We just continue to actually have more and more stuff, but is our capability really growing? Is everything that we're actually doing really a benefit to our business? Not really. We've also taken a look at the very fact is a lot of this stuff, right, becomes for our business, what we call like cost center, okay? And what we want to do is we want to actually take a look at that idea again and start moving it more towards what we call an idea of a data center as being a service center instead. In other words, one that actually does stuff for our business that really does count instead of just taking the cost. Don't get me wrong, without it being here, there's no doubt that we couldn't do the functions that we can do, but what if we actually had it optimized to where we're spending the majority of time really doing the service instead of actually doing the maintenance to the beast that we've actually created here in this data center idea. So that's what we're talking about in terms of benefits. So we want to just do a quick reminder here in this episode of some of those different benefits of why we would choose to actually bring up the idea of data center virtualization, either to those that are actually working, above us when they say, okay, so why would I choose to actually do this? Well, we want to make sure that you actually understand why you would choose to do that, and that's what we're going to go through today.
That's exactly right. There are many benefits to going to virtualization. I've seen them firsthand. I've worked with them because, as we've already hinted at, it's the whole idea of sprawl and just the servers tend to start duplicating themselves inside of our data center. I liken it to the fact that if I'm a user and I drive a car, right? I have a car. I need to go to the store. Well, in IT world, we tend to go, well, I have a car for going to the grocery store, and I have a car for going to the clothing store. I've got a car for going to get frozen yogurt. And we have all these different cars, when really one car would suffice as long as it could go to all those different places. And that's our idea that we're really thinking about when it comes to where we want to start, which is that server consolidation. Bring it down to having only what you need instead of having a bunch of servers that can do these things. We can pare this down. This is the idea, right, Ryan?
It really is. So let's start off with that very idea of server consolidation, because sometimes people don't understand that when we talk about the idea of server consolidation. So let's take a look at my screen here. Hopefully this visual will help us to understand it a little bit better. So if somebody says, hey, what is this about server consolidation? How does virtualization really help us out here? Well, what we can do is, let's say that we have 5 servers running, and each of them are actually running their separate roles. Let's say that one's a domain controller, one's a DHCP server, one's an actual DNS server, one's a file server, email server, whatever you want to call it, okay? So we have those different roles that are actually running. When we take a look at the utilization, right, you go in there, if you're running, let's say, Windows Server 2012 in the background, you right-click on the taskbar, you go and you bring up, of course, the task manager. You take a look at CPU utilization on your domain controller, okay? And you go, wow, the CPU looks like it's running at 6%. I got 8 gigs of RAM, I'm running at 2 gigs of RAM, and you start realizing that gigantic terabyte hard drive that you actually had installed in there, you're taking up, let's say, I'm going to go ahead and be generous, and let's say that we're going to take up 300 gigs of it. Okay, that'd be pretty gigantic. But let's say that we actually do have that many, and it's 300 gigs. Well, what about the rest of the resources that are available? Okay, well, that's where we actually start running into issues. In terms of server consolidation instead, what I hope you can actually see is that you might actually put money into one fairly beefy, fairly high performance server instead, physical server, get up all the RAM that you actually want, but then you can run individual VMs inside of that server instead. And now what you have is actually, instead of 5 physical servers, you have 5 VMs. In other words, 5 virtual machine servers that can really actually highly optimize the utilization of that one physical machine. Now, does it always have to be one? No. You can actually spread it out and cluster it out if you want to. But the very fact is, this is something that can actually be done. And when you start doing stuff like this, right, the very fact is we eliminate what we call the idea of server over provisioning, which is what normally happens here, and the way that Daniel was talking about it. And it's one of these situations, Daniel, a couple of years ago, I remember doing this, is that I went to a place to help set up some infrastructure, and there was a server that was just turned on, and only one person was actually using it. And when I went to them, I said, hey, what is this for? And said, oh, it's a database. It's an old database, but it's a database that still, we need up and running. And so I said, well, let's go ahead and back this thing up, and we can restore the database onto something else if we need to. Well, they said, oh, they've already done that, which was a little bit unusual, that they had actually went ahead and backed it up, and they moved it off to a new server. But I remember looking in the rack, and it was still on. It was still turned on. It was still just sitting there. Well, imagine that. We talk about over-provisioning. Well, we over-provisioned, and they were saying, well, that's just in case that during the testing time that something happened to the new server. And so what did they do? They just left it on, and what happened? It got forgotten about. It's just been sitting there for a couple of years. Nobody even bothered to look, and go, we may just turn this thing off. So they were way over provisioned on a lot of different things that they had. And so simply I said, well, it looks like that we don't really need it. I said, oh no, I need it. So what did I do? I unhooked it from the network is what I did, and just said, well, we'll just leave it alone then. And I just told them, I was like, no big deal. But we tend to over provision a lot, and by doing virtualization, we eliminate that idea of over provision. When we do so, we end up reducing the number of physical servers that we need. which also mean what? Reduction in electricity, reduction in terms of costs that we have, and actually maintenance.
Yeah, maintenance in general. I've actually been a part of this, right? A company I worked for, we had about 100 servers, and then we went to virtualization. We actually went to ESX, VMware, and we went down to about 30 servers, right? We bought, just like what Ronnie said, we got some really high-end, horse-powered, beefy servers, stuck them in there, and that took the vast majority of our physical servers out of the loop. There were a few that still hung around because they needed some dedicated hardware, but for everything else that didn't, we threw them on those servers, ran like a charm. It's amazing how that worked out. Went from having like 5 racks to 2. It was a whole lot nicer.
Yeah, Dan, even in VMware itself actually says when you actually go from the physical down to actually using the idea of virtual machines, most companies end up seeing anywhere of an utilization of that one server, which normally rides, let's say, about 15 to 20%, all the way up to 80% and even higher of that one server. So notice that we're increasing it by almost 4 or 5-fold when we think about this idea of actually utilization. So server consolidation is one of the big benefits that we have when we start considering the idea of actually moving towards our data center virtualization. Why? It's because we actually start reducing that sprawl just very easily, and we actually start upgrading it. The very first one that I dealt with, we had 8 different servers. We actually ended up buying just two servers that we actually replaced, and we started virtualizing everything else. Well, imagine that energy consumption for a small company going from 8 machines that are running with dual power supplies all the time to 2 servers. And we actually had better performance because we also ended up upgrading the actual equipment. We had better, NICs. Network was actually running better instead of the older stuff that we kept around because we didn't know what else to do, and we just kept relying on those things to work. So that was kind of one of those first instances. But server consolidation by far is one of the big ones that we have to think about as well. Okay. Now, the other benefit that we also want to move to, especially if you start talking about data virtualization, is that we start to take a look, or data center virtualization, is that businesses today are rarely just their on-site data center, right? A lot of times we actually do have components that are on-site, but we also have components that are actually in the cloud as some type of infrastructure service of some sort. So you may actually have it where your business does have servers on-site, but at the same time, they may actually be dependent on the cloud to actually provide other services. So for us, let's say here at IT Pro TV, there's a lot of services that we use that are cloud-based, and it makes more sense. But there's also some of the servers that we have here to keep data also on-site as well. So when you start actually now having stuff that you have to manage in the current environment, as well in your local environment, as well as in the cloud, what ends up happening is that you now actually end up working with 2 different management systems that could be a little bit more diverse, right? The very fact is you're used to managing your on-site one way, you're used to managing the cloud through another interface in another way. Well, the goal and idea, of course, too, is that virtualization, being able to virtualize your entire network, prepares you to get ready for the cloud as well. And what they want to do, and what VMware really is stressing, is what we call the idea of an SDDC, okay? And that is a software-defined data center, is what they're actually talking about here. Now, when we start taking a look at that, right, we're trying to move that model away from hardware maintenance, from actually having to make sure that that server's running and that all the switches are connected and everything else, to actually managing that network and instead actually being able to do it consistently regardless of where those things are. So let me kind of show you on my diagram again what we're talking about. So here's what I'm going to say is a typical layout of some of the components that you'll find inside of a data center, and even more. But when we start talking about the idea of a software-defined data center, what I've done here is I've blocked out all of those different components instead. And what this means is that regardless of whether you're talking about where the servers actually are, and what has to manage them in the way that you want to manage them and individual networks and components and stuff, you instead can actually use a single interface, and this actually allows you to manage it essentially through software. By being able to do that, it doesn't matter where those servers actually are. They could be part of your cloud infrastructure. They could be part of a service that you actually do buy a service access to, a subscription to, and they can also be here. So by being able to move into a software management type of system in which you actually are defining everything inside of software. This includes networking, includes the servers, includes the switches, includes everything. Well, now you actually have a single interface and you can control all that. And that is another benefit that we can do. We talk about moving to a fully virtualized infrastructure. And here's the three terms you've got to be familiar with in terms of VMware. Okay? They talk about it in terms of compute, network, and storage. So those are kind of the main components, right? So down here we had the storage in the lower left-hand corner, right? And what I'm saying here is by using this grid is I'm saying we're going to manage that through software. We're not actually worried about what the underlying infrastructure is, whether this is a SAN or a NAS or iSCSI device, whatever it is here. If we're actually trying to do this as a data center, guy, well, we're actually only looking at it through that software interface. The same thing with the servers. If they're virtualized, okay, we're not worried about the physical components. We actually see the whole thing as being the ability to build VMs as we need them. And we actually take the capacity of it and we're managing through that interface again. And even the networking, right? We can build virtual switches that allow us to actually group the things the way that we want to and allow the traffic to pass and do monitoring. And we're all doing it through a same common interface, regardless of where that infrastructure ends up lying. And that's what we want to get to as well. Now you might be saying, well, why is this actually good? Because if you don't have this, right? This is where you do have to call in that Cisco consultant. This is where you do have to actually call in the guy that knows how all this stuff is stuck together and make it work.
That's right. It goes from having to know 10 different technologies and know them actually pretty well to knowing maybe one or two. Definitely you learn ESX, you learn the VMware side of things, and your management starts to dwindle down. The ease of management becomes exponentially increased. It's a wonderful thing to be able to sit down to a console that you're familiar with, that you know, and excuse me, any kind of new concept that comes in, oh, I need to tweak the networking. Well, I don't have to jump into the Cisco IOS and know all that stuff. I can work that through virtual switches. I can work that through all the virtualization that they allow through this type of technology. Virtualization, that's why it's the hot topic, to be honest with you. It's the way everyone's going because of these benefits that we're laying out before you.
Yeah. And the other thing about the data center that I don't have here, but I'm going to move on and show kind of something else. My screen has now turned into something insanely more busy, right? Is the idea of what we call disaster recovery sites. Now, as your network gets bigger, yes, you start relying on disaster recovery sites much more, right? You don't ever want there to be a possibility, that, hey, the main center fails and you don't have a backup, you don't have anything that you can actually switch on over to. So what normally happens is, of course, then, depending on your company's budget, ideally, you would have parity, right? In other words, everything that you'd set up over here in your main production network, you go to your disaster recovery site and you have complete parity. One-to-one, everything's ready to go, and you don't have to worry about it, right? Because everything's set up the same way. Daniel goes, all right, here's how I would configure the firewall over here. Well, then we also go to the disaster recovery center and go, just to make sure, even though we're not changing it, let me go ahead and change that setting over here as well. And then if something does happen, immediately flips over and there you go, okay? So here I have it where this router essentially connects out to the internet, also to the disaster recovery site. So if I do have a service that's coming in, people are hitting my web servers over here, perfectly fine, works just great. But what happens though when this now actually is gone? Well, what should also happen then is that the internet, right? We actually come in through our disaster recovery site, everything is up and running. Now, the problem that we have though is cost, right? That is the most expensive implementation of a data center you can have, okay? And Daniel, since you actually work for a big company, disaster recovery, what do you think?
It's kind of important, just a hair. And when we say kind of important, I always like to say, how much does your data worth to you? That's really what it boils down to. If you lost everything, for some reason, a gas main exploded, your building is obliterated, and along with your data center, obviously, how much would that be worth to you? I mean, obviously the building is going to be hard to replace, but that data, the thing that actually makes up you as an entity, as a business, if that is gone, you basically no longer are a business. You are nothing. You don't have that data. You would have to rebuild from scratch. So disaster recovery is something that we spend a lot of time preparing for. And yeah, it costs us a lot of money. You got offsites, you've got replication going through WAN links, you've got tape backups, you name it, you're probably implementing it. And using virtualization can definitely reduce the amount of management it's going to take to create that scenario.
It really can, and VMware, of course, says, look, not only can we actually reduce that idea of needing parity, but we can actually say, look, what we can do is we can build a seamless infrastructure from your private cloud all the way through to the public cloud and start building our virtualized data center up in the public cloud somewhere if we need to. That way, it's always up and running. It actually has everything that you need. So even if everything goes down, then you might say, well, why is that good? Because you're really paying for a subscription here, and you actually don't have to actually start building up the same physical infrastructure and having another site somewhere else and being able to do all this. So it actually does allow you to be able to actually think about this idea. And of course, there's solutions out there, and VMware, of course, says, we have the perfect solution for you, so you should actually buy ours. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, much more in depth. But at this point, that's what you're seeing, okay? So that's where some of the benefits are too. And remember that as people are actually moving more and more towards the cloud, the idea of the management that we talked about is just much more simple, right? People get a little bit afraid when they say, well, if I'm actually moving to the cloud, I have to learn a new management system. Well, again, with the virtualization technology, you may not have to at all. You have that one seamless interface, everything actually goes and changes that way, okay? Now, all this is for what? It's for the sake of us being able to do, as far as the business goes, what we call business continuity, okay? Being able to establish a virtual type of disaster recovery is a big one. Being able to have what we call high availability is a big one as well. And that's one of those benefits too. Now we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, but essentially high availability says, look, we want to make sure that what we have is essentially no downtime, okay, for things that we have access to. So there's actually even virtualization technology that says what happens if the physical machine itself fails. Okay? How do we actually recover from that if that's what's going on? If all my VMs are on that physical machine? Well, again, you do have redundancy, but the way that the technology actually can work, of course, is it can automatically take a VM that's actually on a failed machine and restart it on another one. Okay? So we actually are going to look at that a little bit more in depth as well. Okay? Also, the way that you do backups, the way that you actually replicate the data, the way that you do all this is actually part of it, that you have a good business continuity plan, even if the physical center kind of explodes somehow and you can't control that and you actually do end up in a disaster recovery situation. It's all about that idea of making sure that your business will run regardless of whether, we are actually worried about too much, as far as the infrastructure goes. We absolutely have, as far as the infrastructure, the ability to say, look, the business can continue as far as the infrastructure. You just have to make sure that everybody's actually in place to continue to run. But overall, though, that's what they're trying to accomplish. So when it comes down to benefits, right, you and I, if we're technical people, we don't tend to look at the business side of things, okay? If you're a business person, you may take a look at some of the technical side, and really that's what this course is designed to do as well, is help someone even with just a business sense to say, this is a good advantage that we want to take a look at, and we have to actually think about that as well. So always think about it in terms of business advantages as well as technologically advantages. I didn't even say that. Technical advantages. So there's financial benefits, there's business benefits, you name it, they're actually all out there for us to take a look at and to think about. The biggest one for most people in business is the reduction of CapEx, right? That capital expenditure as well as the operational expenditure. By far, most people that are actually making the business decision whether we're going to do it or not, it's going to be those two. You can probably say, oh yes, server consolidation all day long. Oh yes, you can reduce this and this. But when you say, look, when we start talking about this, the way that this ends up working is that we'll reduce this expenditure by this much. Then their ears perk up and they are ready to go. So there's always that you want to take a look at. And then the changing of the model, right? That what you can do for your entire business is move from the idea of maintaining a data center to actually using it as a service. Now it becomes a functional thing that, it's not, oh, no, I can't do that today because I've got to actually work on rebuilding that server, Instead, you actually allow the virtualization takeover, and now you have a complete department that can actually do, well, the things that you actually hired them to do, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, Ronnie, I know we spend a lot of time harping on the fact that this does save us a lot of money, and it does. It reduces the costs by a very large amount. But as tech guys out there, if you're watching this as a technical person, maybe not so much a business person, we think of it in terms of the management, the ease of management. That is the biggest. I mean, think about the fact, what would it take to spin up a new server, right? We need another DNS server. We need a new web server. I got to have that, and we need it yesterday. What do? Well, I got to get on my, go to Dell, go to wherever that I'm going to buy a server from, look up, spec out, what am I going to need? I'm going to need this, I'm going to need that, I'm going to need this much RAM, I'm going to need this much processor speed, also stuff. Hard drive storage, don't forget that. It's always a hot topic. And then you buy that, then it's got to ship to you, and then you've got to plug it in, turn it on, install an operating system. You're running through a ton of administrative procedure. It's just a lot of work that you have to do to get this thing up and running. This is, to me, the biggest advantage of virtualization. I need a server yesterday. Okay, what do you need on it? This, and this? Not a problem. It'll be done in 10 minutes. We'll have it basically up and running within the next 10 minutes. It's so fast, so much easier to deploy new technologies and spin up new servers. It's not even funny, is it?
No, it really isn't. Because of the way that technology works, it really does reduce the time of someone that may actually need to be working on something different. So for example, we assign Daniel a project and he's absolutely working his hardest on that project, and you stop him and go, hey, we need that server. Well, that means Daniel has to stop the course of his project to actually do what you need him to do, which can work. Don't get me wrong, he'll probably do it. But at the same time, it stops him from having any more productivity. So increasing the productivity, allowing your IT department to actually do whatever service level that they actually need to, allowing them to be more responsive to the things that they really need to be responsive to, then instead of, like I said, coming in and realizing, man, I can't do all that stuff that's requested of me because, well, 3 of our servers have gone down. We have to rebuild the whole thing. We have to wait for those servers to come in and do all that. You actually are changing the way that the business ends up working, and it makes it much more efficient, much better in terms of financially as well as business-wise. Everybody becomes happier, and it's through that basic technology of virtualization. But now we're expanding it beyond the idea of just a single server, beyond a single PC, to now saying we can do this for the entire data center, and that is one of the keys here. So by understanding those benefits, right, it allows you to be able to talk to people and say, hey, this is why we would choose to do this and why we should take advantage of it as a company. And so that's the last word I'm going to say on that, but just kind of realize that it's a lot, right? But we have to actually be convincing, and we have to be convinced that this is the best way to go. It's
funny, Ronnie, you mentioned productivity, the fact that because I am now faster, more efficient at my job through virtualization, I become more productive. Well, what does that mean to the CEO, the guy that cares about the bottom line? Is that, well, we're getting more bang for our buck out of Daniel because we've increased his ability to be efficient. We've increased his productivity. Every dime that we're giving him to work here is now giving us a bigger benefit. So even at that point, it becomes more about that bottom line. So it's easy to sell. Anybody with the pocketbooks that makes that the shot collar when it comes to money, it's easy to sell them on this type of environment because of how much money it does save. But Ronnie, you've shown us a lot of many benefits. You pointed out just a myriad of different reasons why we should jump into virtualization using VMware, which they do a fantastic job of.
Right.
Like I said, I've worked with them for quite some time. It's an amazing product. Anything else that we want to add to this episode before we wrap it up?
Not on this episode, but do remember those terms. If you haven't heard some of those terms that I've been using, make sure you pay attention to that. It's going to actually appear again when you actually get ready for your exam. So the terminology is key. Even understanding the benefits of virtualization is a big key for us, because you will also be asked about those types of things as well. I can't go any deeper than that, but you've just got to be familiar with those concepts that are actually going to be available out there. And it's one of those things where you have to decide, like, why should I choose virtualization? And you have to know what's actually a true benefit. Is a true benefit the idea of, oh, it's neat, it's cool to virtualize, or does it really help you to save money? Does it really help your productivity? And you've got to know that. You've got to know what those differences are.
Awesome stuff, Ronnie. Well, thanks so much for stopping by, explaining these benefits and advantages to using virtualization. We appreciate that. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you next time.